Hi, everybody. It is really exciting to be here with all of you. It's an unusual time in history for sure, and it's particularly an unusual time to be working with middle school students. I first wrote Middle School Matters when I wanted to compile all of the articles I had been writing for the Washington Post about middle school, which I initially had started writing because there was so little out there to help educators, to help counselors, to help parents figure out how to assist kids as they navigate these difficult years. And since the pandemic started, it has been more clear than ever that we need to be treating this age group as a distinct and unique phase. They really, although they can embody a younger child or an older adolescent at any given time, they simply have such different needs. And I think they're struggling more during the pandemic, in large part because of those needs. We know they want agency. We know they want independence. We know they want to separate right now from their parents and spend more time identifying with peers and hanging out with peers. It's just a developmental imperative for them. And at that exact moment in time when they're so unsure of themselves, when they're so interested in exploring lots of different interests and being with their peers, we essentially have forced them to upend everything and spend 24/7 with their parents, and there's no routine, there's no consistency, there's no normalcy. So today, although I'll be talking about middle school as a phase generally, I am going to try to look at it through the lens of the pandemic, because I do think that it is posing some unique challenges for kids on every front: social, academic, emotional, personal. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about what makes this phase so important. First of all, kids are still very malleable. They're still forming their value system. They're figuring out what's important to them and how to pick a friend, how to be a friend, what they like to do, where their strengths and interests intersect. But at the same time, they are bright enough and sophisticated enough and intellectual enough to really absorb sophisticated ideas, to learn at a rapid pace. Their brains are developing, their bodies are developing. Everything is changing faster than it has at any time in their life, other than from birth to age 2. This also is a critical time because we know it's when their confidence drops. For girls in particular, their confidence that other kids like them drops 46%, and their overall confidence for both genders is dropping about 30%. Between 12 and 14 is when bullying peaks, and although that might suggest that kids in this age group are mean or that they're drama seeking, I actually don't think anything could be further from the truth. I think it goes back to skill building and this idea that they are learning all of these, they're learning how to make their way through the world, and they're going to make a lot of mistakes during this time, but they need a lot of coaching instead of managing. It has a terrible reputation. If you ask a middle schooler if they've seen the movie Mean Girls, or an entire class of middle schoolers if they've seen the movie Mean Girls, they all raise their hands. Their parents are bringing that same negativity to the table, and that cultural rhetoric about the phase is so damaging to kids because it erodes their trust in one another, and it actually erodes their confidence. They start to think of themselves as not being a quote unquote good kid. And so we want to be really challenging that narrative. We want to be helping them get all of these skills they need to be independent, to be autonomous, not just now in middle school, but looking far down the road into the future. And we want to be supporting their parents. Particularly now, I live in a part of the country where we are still all virtual, and that means that as school is starting this fall, it is month 6 of kids being out of school. And I'm going to talk a little bit this afternoon about what that means for kids in terms of their social lives and their academics as well. So in my book, Middle School Matters, I talk about the top 10 key skills middle schoolers need to thrive. And it's not just for the present moment, it's really for life. And these are ones that I think kids in this age group are uniquely situated to pick up, and that we as adults, whether we're educators, administrators, counselors, teachers, parents, coaches, we're all in a position to really support kids as they develop these skills. And I'm going to start by talking about making good friend choices. So during the pandemic, one of the things I've noticed has been intense for kids is something I'm calling quarantine FOMO. I had a 7th grader who said to me, everyone is double bubbling without me. And I said, double bubbling? And she said, yeah, you know, cluster quarantining. And essentially what she's saying is she feels excluded. And I've had kids who tell me they don't want to be on video camera for remote classes because, not because they're worried that people are staring at them, but because it's so uncomfortable to be looking at themselves. I had another kid who showed up for my group and wouldn't turn her camera on, and it was someone who always turned her camera on. And I said, you know, it really makes my day when I can see your face, and I would love it if you turned your camera on so I could see your face. And she said, the face isn't the problem, it's the hair. So all of these developmental changes, all of these emotions that kids in this age group are experiencing on a 10, as a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 in the before times during the pandemic are really amplified. And the same is true for friendships. So one of the statistics I share with kids every year, and I did this prior to the pandemic as well, is that only 1% of friendships last from 7th grade to 12th grade. And at first that sounds terrible. That sounds like there's nothing about 7th grade friendships that's redeemable. But really what that's about is that they're learning how to be a friend. They're learning what they need from a friend. They're learning what they can give to a friend. And along the way, there's a ton of shifting among friend groups. We know from research that 2/3 of friends shift from the beginning of the first year of middle school to the end of the first year of middle school. And I'll talk a little bit more about friendship later, but just keeping in mind that social distancing, whether kids are doing it physically in the school setting with masks and space between them, whether it's online and they're on a screen, their sensitivity is so heightened right now because they can't have those organic positive interactions that they normally have in school. So if they have a misunderstanding, they can't smooth it over the next day. If they might not even need to smooth it over if they just happen to see someone in the hall and realize everything was okay. And I think we know as adults we're feeling a little more sensitive too. So keeping all of that in mind, I think this has been really excruciating for a lot of middle schoolers. It hasn't been all negative. There are kids for whom this has been a break. They haven't been as overstimulated. In our area, we're anticipating that as kids do return to school in person, some of them might not be able to do a complete day all at once just because they're so unused to that kind of stimulation. And that's what schools in Australia are seeing. They're about 6 months ahead of us. We also really want to be focusing right now on helping kids self-regulate emotions. And later on in this presentation, I'll share some specific strategies. But part of it is that kids in this age group are so unused to labeling their feelings. They may not even know the difference between the normal mood fluctuations of puberty and when they're experiencing clinical anxiety or depression. It is not intuitive to ask for help. One of the questions I always ask students a couple times a year is, if you were in a crisis, who is the adult person that you would go to for support? It doesn't have to be a counselor, it doesn't have to be a parent, but it does have to be someone who can give you an assist who's not a child. We want to be really reinforcing the idea that there are some problems that are too big for kids to handle. We want to be normalizing asking for help, and we want to be helping them get in touch with their emotions. Speaking of normalizing feelings and helping them get in touch with their emotions, we know that middle schoolers feel out of sorts. I love the research from the University of Wisconsin, Jeffrey Borman. He shared social stories with new 6th graders when they first started middle school, and then he repeated the exercise about 6 weeks later. And the kids thought they were hearing stories of real 7th graders who had just been through 6th grade. And what those 7th graders told them in these stories is that when they started middle school, they thought the teachers only cared about them if they got good grades. They talked about how at first they didn't feel like they knew where they fit in, that they thought they might never feel like they fit in, but that by the end of the year, they realized that their teachers cared about them as people, that they found their peer group, and they adjusted. And the kids who did this exercise at those 2 intervals had better results in every realm: academic, social, personal. They had even higher graduation rates from high school years down the road. And what that tells me is that we want to be doing everything we can to normalize those feelings that kids are having, and also to be really reinforcing that they won't last forever. And I think that's important right now too, as they're looking at all of this uncertainty and not knowing when the pandemic will end, to be sure we're using words like when we do whatever activity it is, as opposed to if we do, and really helping them preserve that optimism and that sense of hopefulness. We also know, going back to the idea of friendship, that kids are more prone to be assuming that they have been rejected. So I've had plenty of kids who have immediately jumped to the conclusion that a friend hated them because they didn't include them in a Netflix party or because they were not in a group chat. And so we want to be letting them know that everyone is feeling that way and giving them some alternative ways to view the situation. Maybe they thought you were busy. Maybe they thought that you knew you were included, and really helping them with that flexibility of thinking. I talked a little bit about the statistics on friendships. I do want to talk about how we can help the kids who are really struggling socially. So the ones who have been completely excluded because they lack social skills, so they're not included in those group chats. They're not in any way, some of them haven't seen peers in 5 or 6 months in person in my region. And what part of the problem is that they really weren't able to handle the interpersonal interactions even when they were in school, and Zoom just made it exponentially harder. Maybe they were making funny faces, maybe they were interrupting. And whether we're in person or on Zoom, those are the kids who really need some concrete strategies to help them manage the interpersonal dynamics. And we want to make sure that we're setting them up for success. So offering them brief, structured opportunities, whether it's a lunch bunch, whether it's pairing them very thoughtfully with a peer so that they don't make their situation even harder for themselves unwittingly. And then we also want to be keeping an eye on the real extroverts. On the one hand, they're really good at continuing those connections, at figuring out alternative ways to connect, even if things are turned upside down. But on the other hand, they're missing that feedback that is so important to them, and they might be prone to posting something mean, to spreading gossip, to wanting to have the best story. And in addition to empathizing with what they're going through, we want to be validating. Validating doesn't mean you agree or you approve of something. It simply means you understand. So you might say, if I wanted to have everybody paying attention to my story, I might also have wanted to share something that was pretty juicy or that everybody would be super fascinated to hear. But here's why that's problematic. It's much better to be known as someone who's really trustworthy and who is a good friend and who you can count on in a crisis. And so really paying attention not just to the kids who are struggling, but also to the kids who might lash out or act more impulsively because their social needs are not being met. And of course, there's a third group of kids right now who have been fairly content because they're introverts and they don't need as much in the way of stimulation. Teachers, administrators, parents, everyone needs to be building in time for relating, not just teaching. We tend to spend about 90% of our time on teaching, which is when we're sharing expectations, when we are letting them know what the homework assignment is, or what the rules are, or what the academic content is. Relating is when they are the expert, when they are teaching us, whether they're telling us something about themselves, perhaps teaching us how to use a new technology tool, maybe talking to the whole classroom about something that's interesting to them. We want to make sure that we are building in time for that all of the time, but particularly during this period. Foster a positive self-identity. So we know that this is when kids are figuring out who they are, whether they're good enough, they're suddenly acutely aware of how well they stack up to others, or in their mind sometimes how poorly they stack up to others. This is also when a lot of kids are wrestling with issues around gender, sexuality, They are more tuned into their whatever affinity groups they might belong to. This is when it's really helpful to have groups, whether it's LGBTQ, whether it's students of color. We want to be continuing those even if school is virtual, because that's a way that kids can feel really isolated if they're not in school with their peers. We also want to be helping them see the best in one another. Going back to this idea that the whole cultural rhetoric is so negative and they're predisposed not to trust one another, we want to be doing whatever we can to combat that tendency, particularly now when they don't have the in-person interactions that can soften some of that for them or be reassuring. I love the reciprocity ring, which is the give a toss exercise, where you have kids write down on an index card something they need or want but can't provide for themselves. It could be anything from, I could use a book recommendation. It could be, my parents are getting divorced and I want someone to talk to who could relate. It could be really anything you could imagine. You then place the cards around the room, and the kids don't have their names on those cards. Have everybody walk around, read the cards. If it's something they can help someone with, you have them write their initials. And if they can't help but they relate, have them write me too. Then collect the cards and tell the kids to pay attention, because you don't know who wrote down which request, and they might want to know which classmates offered to help them. When I did this, I was nervous because I worried, what if there's a card that doesn't have anybody volunteering to help? This was the first time I did it, and I let them know that I didn't want them to put their initials unless they would be willing to help anyone in the class, even if it was the most annoying person in the class. I also said that if nobody wrote their name on their card, they could come talk to me or one of their advisory teachers to crowdsource and brainstorm who might be able to help them. It could be somebody in a different grade. And when I collected them and nervously looked at the cards, it was amazing. There were initials, there were me too's on all of them. And when I got to the last card, it said, I could really use some help making friends, because I know that no one in the grade likes me. I know that no one wants to hang out with me, and I want to change that, but I don't know how. And everybody welled up, all the adults in the room, because every single kid in that room signed their initials to that card. And I don't think any of them would have expected everybody to be willing to help, particularly a few kids who were not known for being extra kind in that way. But when you give kids in this age group an opportunity to help, they really do rise to the occasion, and it reinforces this idea that they are there to support one another. And I think we want to be doing that now, in particular, there's been in addition to FOMO, I've heard a lot of jealousy. It could be people are potting up without them. It could be that someone had a pool and they didn't have a pool, or that someone else's parent was less restrictive with social distancing and they were able to cluster quarantine with another family. But I think that kids are feeling more of a sense of lacking than they might ordinarily. And kids in this age group already are feeling competitive and doing a lot of comparing. So focusing on that building of community is especially important. I also talked to them about the upside and downside of popularity. There's research out of the University of California, Robert Barris, that shows that kids try to climb the ladder of the hierarchy by stepping on the head of the person right below them. So they're really stepping on the heads of the people they would consider their friends. And when they get to the very tippy top of that hierarchy, they actually stop being mean or using power and aggression to get to the top, which suggests that it's not a character flaw. They really are exhibiting that behavior in order to gain status. And I always explain to kids that the happiest kids are not the ones who are the most popular. They're the ones out to left field or right field, because they're just not engaging in that game and they're surrounded by true friends, even if it's just a few. Whereas the most popular kids might seem like they have a lot of friends, but those kids are jockeying for position and not necessarily being kind to one another. There's also research showing that the most popular kids tend to have more problems later in life with relationships, with substance abuse, because using power and aggression to get status is only adaptive at most through 12th grade, and after that it gets in people's way. Teach kids to embrace differences. So we know that kids are forming their identity. We know that they're drawn to like. They want to be around other kids who are like them. And so this is an opportunity to really help them get to know other kids, to understand that other people have backstories too. And the beautiful thing about imparting this skill now when they're so insecure is that if they really embrace this idea that everyone is deserving of respect and everyone has a backstory, they're far more accepting of themselves and they're far more self-compassionate. One of the silver linings to me of the pandemic and of remote learning in particular is that it's an opportunity to mix kids up a little bit more. We can, and also to bring in more diverse speakers. We always want to be making sure that the curriculum is diverse and that they are going on field trips or watching videos or reading texts that showcase different people's lives and really broadening their perspective. But right now we can bring in diverse speakers to do lunch bunches, to do read alouds, to do all kinds of activities, and we can invite kids from different peer groups to give them a chance to get to know one another. There's a nonprofit called Beyond Differences that has an activity called No One Eats Alone Day, and the founder of the company about a year ago was sharing a story about a girl who ate lunch alone with an aide in the cafeteria. She was in a wheelchair and she needed help to eat, and nobody sat with her, none of the kids. And on No One Eats Alone Day, the kids made a point of eating with her. But after that one day, when they got to see that she was funny and that they had stuff in common, they ate with her going forward. So kids often need help with the initial introduction, but then after that, they're really willing to take it from there on their own. We can, and when we do the mixing up virtually, what's nice is that it's a lot less intimidating than walking into a crowded cafeteria and sitting at a table with your theater kid. You might not want to sit with the kids on the football team because it's more intimidating, and vice versa. But online, it's a lot easier to get kids engaging with other people and from other cliques. It's also an opportunity to do some clique busting. We want to make sure we're not ignoring what's happening in the news, especially now. We've had, between the racism and the police brutality and COVID and everything going on, kids, as we get the year underway, we know that they're coming in with different layers of trauma, that they're going to need to process it. While some kids have experienced it personally, some kids have had lots of opportunities to talk about these issues with adults and maybe even participated in protests. There are other kids who have been listening and absorbing all of the news but have not been able to process it with an adult. So we want to make sure we're not ignoring that as kids return to school and giving them an opportunity to share their own experiences. The shadow a student exercise is one of my favorite ways for educators to build empathy. Until you spend a day shadowing a student, you have no idea how exhausting it is to be a middle schooler. And it is so revealing. We had one student who was one of my frequent flyers in the counseling office, and he was sure that everyone hated him. And when he would come to talk to me, he would tell me that no one was sitting with him at lunch, that he wasn't really feeling like he was embraced at recess, that he never felt like people passed the ball to him or talked to him. And I would try to problem solve with him and come up with ideas. But one of the teachers who did the shadow student shadowed him and came back and said, "You're not going to believe this, but his interpretation is so off base. He absolutely is well liked. He's really included. In fact, people seek him out." And so going forward, instead of just listening and offering some suggestions, I really started to challenge his assumptions and help him look at it a little more expansively. You know, kids misinterpret feedback around 40% of the time in this age group, whether they think a teacher doesn't like them, whether they think a peer doesn't like them. And we want to make sure that we as adults are super consistent in terms of our body language, our tone, the words we choose, but also recognizing that kids might misinterpret a comment, or they might think that we are being critical or judgmental when what we've said is neutral or even positive. So it's an opportunity to really get to know kids better and also to look for room for improvement in the school setting. Right now, I think it will be fascinating. I plan to try to shadow a student virtually. It's a little less possible to do that anonymously, but I think it would be fascinating to see what the experience of being online all day is like as a student. So when you're talking about middle schoolers who are hypersensitive, who are insecure, who are forming their identity, they're not going to be the most natural risk takers. You can make a mistake in a lab and suddenly you've dropped a notch in the eyes of your peers, and it can be a crushing blow. It can throw your whole day off. One stray comment can make you feel like the world is ending and make it totally impossible to concentrate in math class. One thing we don't want, though, for students to do is to avoid risks altogether. So what I like to do, and every year I have some students, there's one day when we have the 7th graders do their own tiny TED Talks. And when they are doing these TED Talks, there's a lot of anxiety leading up to that moment. And I know I'm going to find kids crying in the bathroom just before they have to give that speech. It's very personal too. They're talking about a salient part of their identity. And it could be that they have a learning challenge or that they're adopted. And so I practically camp out in the bathroom waiting for the kids who I know will be coming at this point. And when I find them or I hear them crying, I usually surprise them by saying, "Are you okay? Are you worried about the presentation?" And they say, "How did you know?" Explain that it happens every year. And what I do is I help them rank the risk on a scale of 1 to 10. How big of a risk is doing this speech? And if they say it's a 9 or even a 10, I'll say, what would constitute a risk in the 4 to 7 range? Because what we want to be doing is finding that range that will challenge them just enough that it reinforces the idea that they can do it and doesn't reinforce the idea that they can't do it, but not so much that if it doesn't go well, forevermore their amygdala will fire danger, danger, danger when they're in that situation again. So we want to be setting them up for success. So I've had kids who will give a speech without getting videotaped, which is something we normally do. I had a student who gave the talk with her back to the audience. I've had kids who have done it to just a few kids first. One kid looked down and read from the paper the whole time as opposed to making eye contact. I don't really care what they do as long as they're moving toward getting to the point where they can do it on their own and they're not avoiding it completely, because we know that exposure will help them overcome the phobia and minimize it for them going forward. Another way to really help kids learn how to fail is to make sure that we are celebrating those moments, celebrating their mistakes. One of the first grade teachers in my school doesn't give her first graders pencils with erasers for the entire year, because she really explains that she wants them to make mistakes, and that's a good thing. And she wants to see what they've crossed out and what they've done instead. And I think such a beautiful way to start school. A second grade teacher who was new one year was trying to figure out what was going on, because the kids were so surprised that they had erasers, and they were explaining that you don't need erasers because mistakes are a good thing. And that second grade teacher was so impressed. The middle school example of that, one of my favorites, comes from Ivanhoe Girls Grammar School, which is in Australia, and they have Celebrate Failure Week. At the beginning of the week, all of the teachers beam into each classroom and share what their biggest failure was. One teacher even shared that she had failed out of education school. She clearly went back and was able to make it through, but that was really showing a lot of vulnerability. After everybody admits their biggest failure to the kids, they teach them some really esoteric skills, things like reciting medieval poetry and jousting, things the kids have never done before. And at the end of the week, they all get up on stage one at a time and perform this skill for the entire school. And everybody laughs, but they're laughing together. They're not laughing at the kid. And it helps reinforce this idea that it's okay to learn as you go, which is so important. And we can make time to reflect in class. It could be math class, it could be English class. What mistake did you learn the most from this week? Why? And just make that a part of the discussions. The idea of oscillating narratives comes from, there's a study out of Emory University that shows that the #1 predictor of kids' well-being is understanding that their family members, their own family members, have what's called oscillating narratives. It wasn't a straight line of success from point A to point B. Maybe somebody dropped out of college and then went back, or maybe somebody's grandparent or great-grandparent was a Holocaust survivor or started a business that failed because the warehouse burned down, but then they rebuilt the business. The equivalent in school would be really sharing biographies, sharing moments in history that show that nobody's path or journey is a straight line. I love books like Wonder or Harry Potter that are hero's journey narratives. And middle school is really a stranger in a strange land experience itself. You go to middle school, it's strange, it's new, you don't know what to expect, you experience some bumps along the way, and you come out changed. And that's really what the hero's journey is. And we want kids to see themselves as the hero of their own journey, to understand that the main character is actually not the princess or the superhero. The main character in the story is the villain. It's the big bad wolf. It's the tornado in The Wizard of Oz. It's the pandemic, and the hero emerges because of that challenge, because of that villain. So going back to this idea of helping them address emotional needs, knowing that they really are not equipped to have a big repertoire of coping strategies. In fact, I just did last week our orientation with our new middle schoolers, and they did not even understand the word coping strategies. They were new to our school, and I said, does anyone know what a coping strategy is? And none of them did. And I asked them, does anyone know what they do to make themselves feel better? And again, there was silence. And so I switched up the question, and I said, what do you do when you can't fall asleep? And suddenly the floodgates opened. Well, when I can't fall asleep, that probably means I was on my computer too late, or I was looking at upsetting news, or I need to listen to music. I need to talk to my mom and get my worries out, whatever it happens to be. But we want to be getting them in touch with this idea that it is okay to struggle, but we want to be, again, labeling what it is that they're feeling and figuring out what works for them. In the classroom, you can use mental health check-in charts. If it's virtual, you could use an anonymous Google Doc, or a Google Doc where only you can see what they're feeling. They can write their emotion in the chat. I like the mood meter from the Yale Ruler program. Or you could just have them rank it on a scale of 1 to 10. But when you do that, what you want to make sure you do is not just stop there. It's great to see that maybe there's some normalizing, that other people are feeling the way that they're feeling, but we want them to be proactive. We want them to make the connection between their thoughts, their feelings, and their behavior, and to know that there's something they can do, that these emotions don't just come out of nowhere. One teacher, a 5th grade teacher who I observed, used a Google chart to have kids say how they were feeling, and he specialized in math, and so he had a very elaborate -4 to 4 scale. I probably, as a counselor, would have chosen a different system, but a -4 would mean you were so upset you were crying. And one kid chose a -4, and he always has them circle up after they share their number, and they go around in a circle. And when they got to this kid, the question was, why was it a -4? Why were you crying? And the child said, because I got in a big fight on the way to school with my parent. And so then the teacher of these 5th graders said, does anyone have any ideas for what might make him feel better? And they came up with ideas like, maybe you could let him email home and say that, or call home even, and just try to get the feelings out, and could make a point of having a conversation at home later at the end of the day. Because they were fighting about being late for school, maybe he could set his alarm for earlier. But the point was that this teacher was reinforcing the idea that there were things the child could do to feel better. They weren't stuck. And when you label that feeling with specificity, instead of just saying, I'm overwhelmed, you're not as likely to get paralyzed. And proactivity is important in so many different areas of middle school. If a kid fails a math test, they might just cry, which would be, reactive, maybe get angry. They might be passive and just think, I'm going to be terrible at math forever. But if they're proactive, they're going to think, well, maybe I could go get extra help, or maybe there are extra points, or maybe I studied the wrong thing and can study something differently the next time. And that's really what we want middle schoolers to be doing. I'll share a story. This was from pre-pandemic. It was last year. I came into school and I bumped into one of my 7th graders. I'll call him Matthew, and he was clearly ticked off and upset. And I said, "What is wrong?" And he told me that he had been walking down the hall, and one of the girls in his grade, who he battled with all of the time, had, given him a sharp elbow, and he had been upset about that, and he elbowed her back. And a teacher saw him but didn't see that he had been elbowed and scolded him in front of everybody. And he was upset, and he said, the teachers always think it's the boy's fault, and she was the one who started this. And I said to him, "Do you want to go talk to the teacher and tell them how you feel?" And he said, no, she hates me. It's not going to make a difference. I'm just going to forget about it. In retrospect, I really should have pushed the issue and had him talk to the teacher, because here's what happened. At first, he was okay. He started to go through his day. He stuffed down those feelings. He held it together. But by the end of the day, when he was in one of his last period classes, he started calling out random words. And it wasn't even getting a laugh from peers. It was words like soap and shampoo and vacuum cleaner, and the other kids were looking at him and not really understanding why he was behaving that way. And I think that was making him feel even more awkward, but he kept doing it. And eventually the teacher turned him out of the class. That's when he came to me. And I said to him, I'm really curious, not just in what just happened, but I'm wondering why you were calling out random words. That's the part that I'm really fascinated by. And he said, it's because I'm an idiot and I hate myself. And that to me was just such a telling story about what it's like to be a middle schooler. They really need to know that they're worthy, that they're a good kid, that their teachers like them, that they are treated fairly. They have such a keen sense of equity and justice, and all of those things had been triggered for him, and he just fell apart by the end of the day. So we want to be helping them find that path forward. In this case, he was able to make amends with the teacher. I helped him with that. A similar story comes out of a school in New York. I had actually tweeted out that I'd been talking to one of my own students who had been really mean to a kid, and the kid she was mean to had come to my office and was crying so hard she was practically on the floor. She could practically not stand up. And I was so confused, because a child who had been mean to her, and there was no question that what she had done was mean, was someone who had typically been quite nice. Not only was she very nice, but she had come to our school because she had been bullied at her prior school. And I had an excellent relationship with this kid. I brought her to my office, and at first I started to say, I'm surprised. I wouldn't have expected this from you. And I could tell I was getting nowhere. So instead I said, "Do you think you were your best self?" And her body language changed, and she started to cry, and she said no. And she really did want to make amends with this other kid, and she wanted to explain why she had done that. And part of it was that she couldn't really explain it. Often we see kids who've been bullied sometimes trying on that behavior with other kids, but she did really want to make amends. But I had to give her that out, to make it about her, what she wanted for herself. So when that happened, I tweeted out the best self line. And a couple of days later, I got a message from a principal in New York State who said, "I wanted to share a story with you." He had an 8th grader, two girls come up to him in the cafeteria, and they said, Mr. Adams, come quick. Sophia is crying. And when he asked why, it turned out that earlier in the day, a boy in the 8th grade had gone up to her and said that this other kid was going to be asking her out. And much as she wanted him to ask her out, she knew that this kid was in a different peer group, and she was a little bit suspicious about it and didn't think it was true. But when she got to the cafeteria and she was in line, sure enough, that boy did ask her out. And in that moment, she believed it, because she had been primed by the other kid to believe it, and she was happy. And But then when she turned around to walk back to her table with her food, she could see that the entire table of boys, including the one who had told her about the boy who would ask her out and the boy who was going to ask her out, were all laughing. And it had all been a setup. So Mr. Adams pulled the boys into his office and had a similar experience to me, where he wanted to say, who does that? That's so cruel. That's so mean. It's like the worst thing you could do to another middle schooler. They were defensive. They were stoic. He was getting nowhere. He pulled out his iPad to take some notes and happened to see my tweet from the night before, changed gears, took a deep breath and said, "Do you think you were your best self?" At which point they were willing to engage. They started to cry, just like my student. They wanted to make it better. He called in their parents. They worked on a solution for going forward. So really giving them that path, starting with phrases like, "I'm guessing you lied because you were worried about my reaction," or "I'm guessing you cheated because you felt a lot of pressure to do well," or maybe you were worried that other people would think you weren't doing what you're doing. We need to be giving them that pass so that they know that we still see them as a good kid. We still see them as having fundamentally a good character and that they're redeemable. I sometimes use the values card sword to have kids figure out what matters to them. It's online. There's about 100 different values. Have kids spread them out on the floor, pick their top 10, spend some time thinking about it. And then the instruction I give to them is, the reason it's important to know what matters to you, and these values might change over time, is because when you're in a difficult situation, when you're not sure what the right thing to do is, ask yourself which of the two decisions is consistent with your values. And most of the time, even if you've made the wrong choice, you'll be able to live with it because it's consistent with what your core values are as they're developing. Competency is so huge, particularly right now. Kids feel powerless. The recipe for stress from a woman named Sonia Lupien in Montreal is NUTS, nuts. The N is for novelty. The U, it's new. The U is for uncertainty. You don't know how it will turn out. The T is for threat to ego. You don't know how you're going to manage it, whether you're going to be up to the task, whether you'll maintain your friendships, whether you'll achieve academically. The S is for sense of control. And if you look at the pandemic right now, no one has any sense of control. It's all new. It's all uncertain. Everybody's learning new things, whether you're a teacher or a kid. And so the antidote to all of that is to give them back a sense of empowerment, to set them up for success. Again, not lowering expectations, but really helping them figure out that desirable level of difficulty, giving them some choice, letting them demonstrate their learning in ways that they choose, letting them help generate rules. This is a picture of the dog whisperer. And the dog whisperer, he had all of these misbehaving dogs, and he found out that when he put backpacks on them with water bottles and turned them into pack mules, suddenly they behaved because they had a purpose. And kids are no different. There's a principal who shared a story with me. He had a bunch of sixth graders who never behaved and were constantly being referred to the main office, and he made them his tech crew, and he taught them how to use incredibly expensive tech equipment. And there was a graduation, and the technology director was sick and couldn't show up, and these kids were able to manage it all on their own, all of the technology. And for the rest of middle school, they were never referred to the main office again. It was really amazing. And going back to this idea of equity, we want to make sure that whatever policies we put in place, that we are enforcing them consistently and fairly. So with that, I want to make sure that I leave time for questions and give you a chance to ask me anything that you're interested in talking about. Thank you.